Hello, today I will be talking about the framing effect. We'll go over the textbook definition and then I will explain it in my own definition, as well as talking about how it affects Generation Z as well as preceding generations, and then talking about how to alleviate it. But first, the more academically minded way to frame this whole thing is how information is presented, not the specific details in and of itself. So this can apply to politics, it's going to apply to sociology, and more importantly, the perception that this creates across generational lines proves that the framing effect is not immune to anybody specifically. And it's all about how attention is driven. People could say this is misleading. People could say this is kind of a subversion of the mind. And we're going to be getting into the details of that in a sec here. But one of the best examples to frame, ironically, to frame the framing effect is generational. How young people are divided from people older than them, not just for petty reasons, but because there is a psychological effect. And there's also psychological warfare that is inherited by older people and then reinforced to the youth for generations to come, unless the cycle can be broken, which I argue can be. We'll get to that towards the end. But I would like to frame this whole discussion kind of separately from a lot of the science-based, data-driven stuff that was on the website. I want to focus on identity. I think that's the best way to frame this whole thing. Gen Z, Zoomers, another colloquial term, they have a unique perspective, and that comes with preferences and patterns. And when you compare them to older generations, you can see those preferences and patterns in the older people. But Zoomers have their own identity. Some of it isn't being claimed, and I'm going to explain how. One thing that unites them are the perceptions that they have seem to be distinct, and you'll see that when they are vulnerable to some framing effects that aren't quite present in preceding generations. And so that's how I would argue all of this stuff is real. The three main things we'll be going over is frames, comparisons, and associations. More so when I'm talking about Gen Z, I'm talking about their vulnerability to things like politics, sociology. Those are the themes I'm going to be touching on and going through those three things. And so I think that identity is the model. I think that identity can often have an immune system, which maybe that would make more sense talking about it in the academic sense, the whole framing of all this stuff. So I want to use identity as kind of my definition as to why people are presenting things in a dramatic way rather than getting hung up on the little details. That is the framing effect that is happening for young people specifically. And I think some of the older people are not quite getting it. There's also that popular trend of calling people boomers. That's kind of a joke, but it also gets at the heart of this model, which is identity. So some of these modern references may be helpful. How do we contrast the model that the older generations have and the ones that people do today? I would argue that perception of boomers and Gen X specifically, we can find trends where they are vulnerable to marketing campaign. They are members of a consumer class. That is something that I think is unique to those specific generations. It happened before, but these are the ones that really modernized it, and their perspectives are what got inherited to the youth. So when we want to trace where all these framing effects happen, these marketing tactics, corporate tactics, I think a lot of it can be traced to 1960s, 70s mentality. And another word for this presentation really is individualism. Individualism is an identity that is really key to boomers and Generation X. I think that you'll often find when they are participating in politics, when they're talking about sociology, their whole structure, like structuralism in the philosophical sense, structuralism really is their starting point when addressing any topic. So to bring it back to that identity theme, I think that individualism has to be addressed specifically as a structure, as basically the main frame that everything falls into place. People can talk about how some of the corporations are dishonest, the marketing misleads perception, it drives our attention in very narrow ways. But ultimately, the only way that you fall victim to those specific things is if you start with a model, that being individualism. And so Generation Z is no stranger to this. They also fall victim to it, but I would argue they are often more collectivist. And so when they kind of wage war against the boomers, calling them these derogatory names, what they're really getting at the heart of is their individualism. That is their American personality. Contrast that with the Zoomer personality. The Zoomer personality really is less mental. When these studies are talking about these college students and they divide men and women to try and get the data, I think that tactic in and of itself is very limited, because what you're really talking about is cognition. You're talking about some of these mental structures that you can base a lot of your data off of. The Zoomer really is kind of neglecting some of that more rigorous, some of that more academically minded things. And they're really coming from a place of spirit, a place of emotion, which can be vulnerable to marketing trends as well. But it's ultimately a different way of perceiving the world. Their framework is different. And I would argue it's less individualistic than some of the boomers and Gen X, which unite in this sort of framework of individualism. I see the Zoomers as something that are a bit more jovial. They're a bit more spontaneous, and it's not really structured. To go back to that structuralism, they are kind of opposing this kind of status quo that has been established by Gen X and boomers. They are the establishment, and Zoomers are kind of breaking that model. They're on the internet and they're finding things that are less mainstream. They're kind of going based on their friend groups, which are not abiding by the mainstream. And so I think that's a dichotomy that a lot of people miss. So ultimately, when we're talking about these frameworks, what we're really saying, like the little girl in this example, she really is, with a lack of education, with a lack of conventional wisdom, she is tapping into an identity that is authentic and expressing it in a way that is intellectual, but it's less cognition, less mental. And so I think that is the way on how you do things is very different from the things in and of themselves. It is still content, there is substance, but it's about that expression. Generation Z has that spirit. And often when you see a lot of young people kind of get belittled by the older generations, it's true. They are not falling with the establishment, the mainstream. That's because the approach is different. It's a different framework. And so there can be an alliance between all generations. We are all underneath like an American culture, a macro culture, and all the topics affect us. But we have to remember where our blind spots are. The older generation is a lot more structured, individualistic, kind of not doing group projects in the workspace. The Zoomer is a lot more jovial, and they're going to bat for their group. So even when they do things on the internet, which is by themselves, or watching TV by themselves, it is still a collective activity because all of the Zoomers are doing it. They are united even in their isolation, if that makes sense. It is still a collective effort. And we don't really categorize it that way conventionally because we are still using the framing effect of older generations. So you can see how even the way we're talking about it is limiting because there's less of that spontaneous creativity. It is still educational. It's just not the way that an older establishment would do so. And so some of the more academically minded, talking about the framing effect itself. One of the ways to understand sort of the way that people process a lot of information, the way that they kind of channel their positive and negative reactions to things, some of the activity in their frontal and the PC. So it kind of suggests that memory and the mechanisms within their brain are kind of adjusting risks. And so it is very intellectual, but one of these these are ideas that are kind of being planted into people's brains. These are like ideas that are passed on from older generations. And so adapting to risk for the older generation is more intellectual, it's more cognition. For Zoomers, they are internalizing them. They're processing them emotionally. And so what a lot of these studies kind of lack, and I think some of the age groups in these generations, or in these studies rather, would be more telling. I think you're seeing the approach from a younger generation would be a lot more different. And so we don't really get a lot of data that specifically addresses Zoomers. And so when we're talking about this fight or flight response, it is instinctual, but it is a mental pattern that has kind of been like pushed to generations. And so it becomes a status quo. The fight or flight response can be adjusted by stepping outside the comfort zone. But it's been so normalized to process, encounter things a specific way, so that you have to do it in an academic way. You have to do it intellectually. It is more talking and less listening. The Zoomer can internalize a lot of information, but not say it, but not teach it. So that is kind of the differences in the approach. And really, it kind of gets into a philosophical debate about how exactly do we tell people how to process all this information, since it's kind of like a nature versus nurture debate. How do, for people who are always experiencing encounters, and they're doing it in this very, the kind of not bait and switch, kind of in a reactionary way. They're always just going to be reacting to things because it's instinctual. I would argue that there is a way to fix this. As I said, the studies don't really address a lot of this. The way that people process positive and negative emotions, I feel like the older generations don't really get at the heart of this, and even some of the neuroscience doesn't properly address this. I think when people are encountering chaos, I think they need to look at the landscape completely differently. There needs to be kind of establishing the fact that you have these two identities. You have to recognize that older people and younger people are going to respond to things differently. And so if we can address the individualism, which is a crutch for the older generation, and how it's kind of pull yourself by the bootstraps, me generation attitude, we can recognize that structure is going to be their go-to pattern. That's their get out of jail free card. We can see that the younger generation is not very well read, not very intellectual. They could learn from some of this experience working as the older generation did, but keeping that kind of youth at heart, that young at heart approach. And so it's about being less individualistic, kind of seeing a community among the young, having that alliance with the young and the old. And I think that would be very beneficial. I think you would reduce a lot of the framing effects that keep people stressed out, keep people kind of isolated in this way, where the older generation is looking for solutions for them at the behest of everyone else, or in spite of everyone else, rather. The younger people are not even getting to this point at all. They're just in isolation. We don't know what they're doing. Some of the hard data doesn't really address them based on tactics that would work just for them. We're only using the older models. And so that's why it's almost like we have to reorient the neuroscience, reorient the study tactics, because everybody has their own approach. Some of it is more individualistic, some of it is more collective, but ultimately what binds us all together is it is identity based. We need to kind of reach an identity consensus across generations, because we all have a different approach. And so that's how you can address the framing effects. That's how you can change, and it's perfectly on topic with the framing effect theme. It is how you do it which matters. That's what's receptive to people. That's how people get affected by marketing. It is the how that matters, rather than the specific by the numbers thing. So that is how you address and alleviate a lot of that stress. It is a model problem. It is a structural thing that is happening within science. There has to be a less academic approach and one more based on generations.